recession in 1992, and out of nowhere came a very unknown person from a state that usually does not generate leaders, political leaders, which is Arkansas. So Bill Clinton came in power. Nobody expected him. Just like Obama came because of the mess of 2008 economic recession, pretty much. So this is where politics are getting more affected by economic well-being of the citizens than anything else. The most common problem now in economic well-being is not average economic well-being of all the people or even the peasants or the rural population, but unfortunately the most politically volatile situation arises when you have young educated people, and the unemployment in that subpopulation, once it crosses about 21, 22%, they are likely to revolt against the system. And they all have social media today. So we watch in every country about economic well-being, and within economic well-being, this particular segment. So more and more governments have been saying that we need to come about economic reforms, and hopefully with those changes we will have economic growth, and therefore people will be happy in the process. It is the economic reforms that made China what it is. Deng Xiaoping had a famous saying, whether the cat is black or white, it doesn't matter so long as it catches mice. That's pragmatism. That's not ideology. India under 1991, under financial crisis, had to reform, and we have seen the change. In less than 30 years in China, they have already generated 1 million millionaires. That was never thought even possible. And Chinese economy is still somewhat regulated. It took about 100 years in America to create 1 million millionaires, although I don't believe that materialistic wealth is the only way to measure a nation's success, but at least one indicator. In India, it has crossed about 250,000 millionaires and a few billionaires, for example, which is interesting. So this economic reform does create economic uplift of everybody, sometimes a little more in favor of the people who are rich getting richer, and people who are average staying average or lifting a little by and large. So there is some sort of an income redistribution, or how do we lift everybody up to a level which becomes a social policy. The rise of the new middle class is equally important. In this 1 billion population in each one of those two nations, the consumers are all at once, wanting to go from the agricultural society and living very traditionally to a more contemporary modern society. They are all very brand conscious now, interestingly. And I call this in India, and there's a counterpart in China or in Malaysia. In India, I call this as a call center couple, because India is famous for call centers, right? So what's a call center couple? This is two young people. In India, most of the children stay at home to finish their college education, not just high school education. It's a 10 plus 2 plus 3 system. If you can get admission, the cost of education, higher education, is so affordable. So you stay home, fees are low, and then the boy meets the girl now in the college rather than families arranging the marriages. Neither of these couple wants to live with their parents anymore. Parents are actually a nuisance. They interfere in my freedom, in my own desire. They want to hold me back from what I want to do. So they are the first-time buyers of everything. Not just cell phones, appliances like washing machines, an HD TV, for example, but they are the first-time buyers of a motorcycle or actually a car. So the small car markets are just exploding in India. As motorcycles, Honda on its own came to India in motorcycle business, and this year it sold 2 million units, just one company. It is about 30% market share When you multiply that by 3 or 4 times, India is the largest scooter or a two-wheel motorcycle market in the world. The best buyers are farming community, where there is no mode of transportation, even like a bus. Motorcycle is the only mode in a rough terrain, essentially. It is also a means of livelihood, and the farmers are willing to pay a price for a branded category. This young couple does not know how to cook, clean, take care of children. So the biggest outsourcing is not IT outsourcing in corporations, but the young household eating out all the time. So outsourcing comes home, which means whatever earning they have, actually they don't do the value add on raw materials by making, let's say in India, chapatis or the bread, but buying in the marketplace. When you buy in the marketplace, the multiplier is about 5 times compared to the raw material. So economy grows because the value add is done by an outside merchant, a producer, whatever it is, and that's fascinating. It's a very large market emerging all of a sudden, and unless you participate in the China and India middle class market, especially consumer products, you are likely not to succeed on a global basis, unless you want to remain a niche player. And the last one is that emerging economies have an enormous resource advantage. I mean, the Russia, even today, the largest advantage is oil and gas. Brazil, very large advantage in soybeans on the one hand, forestry on the other hand, iron ore, it just goes on and on. Today, I don't know whether you know, but 50% of all crushed frozen orange juice that we consume in America is all made in Brazil. America is exiting agriculture sector gradually. What used to be an orange county in Florida, where Disney World is right now, it was nothing but miles or kilometers of orange groves. Today you don't see any orange groves. It's all basically a entertainment center, or in fact it is becoming very large, a convention city and maybe a corporate city, interestingly. So these nations still have enormous amount of resources to their advantage for which they can do value add quite a lot. Here are the forecasts, therefore. In 2015, based upon IMF, China will become the largest single economy measured, GDP measured in terms of purchasing power parity, which is an index in the 90s United Nations and IMF created to make these large nations looked upon in a more attractive way for investment and for trade. China is 17 trillion. India is 6 trillion, but India is underestimated because 40% of the Indian economy is a cash economy. Nobody knows how much actually the transactions are taking place. So my estimates are that India is probably by 2015 about $10 trillion in economy based on this measure by and large. And China also probably slightly underrepresented. It will become bigger by 2020 definitely than even United States, which is unthinkable. Remember, these two nations 30 years ago, nobody would have ever thought would become one of the largest markets and actually super economic powers in the process. So this is very key to understand. If you look at the rest of the nations, you will see significant part come from emerging economies. And of course, by 2015, definitely by 2020, more than half of the total GDP of the world will come from emerging economies. And China's growth will slow down after 2020 due to aging of its population. China will become affluent and aging, very similar to Japan. Japan did not have to age, but after World War II, most women became factory workers. They changed the traditional dress kimono to wear blouse and skirt. And as producers of wages and income and products, they became equally contributors into the society, but also at the same time the fertility rate began to come down. China will go through the same thing. The one-child policy of China that they put together 2 generations ago now is going to clearly make them very affluent very fast, but the number of people in China will decline. And like Japan, I don't see China having massive immigration allowed into the Chinese economy or into the Chinese country by and large. India, on the other hand, has a reverse issue. After 2020, India's growth will accelerate faster than the China growth. So China goes very fast but plateaus. India is coming along and rises much sharply because it will remove two, maybe three major constraints. The biggest constraint is infrastructure, where Malaysia is very good actually. In fact, I tell you, this country is impressive. To an outsider, when you come, first thing I noticed was the modern infrastructure everywhere. Second thing I noticed was the cleanliness of the nation. Think about that one. That's absolutely incredible. Excitement seems to be here in many ways. If you go to the States, you will see the infrastructure is aging. Always one escalator at airport is not working. You see now a lot more, in fact, the waste paper being strewn around. That was unthinkable in the 60s in America, but America infrastructure is aging. The sewage system alone needs $1 trillion of renovation because it was bought under corporate bonds, as they call it, municipal bonds, many, many years ago, but they did not have the money set aside to revitalize or to maintain properly, and they've been aging for 60, 70 years now roughly. So the infrastructure is a weakness in America. Infrastructure is a weakness in India, but now there's a possibility that more and more infrastructures like roads, ports, airports will be built faster and faster, energy, power generation, etc. And the country probably will reform a lot sooner out of sheer necessity in its industrial policy, especially for foreign direct investment, and therefore the rise in the growth of Indian economy. This used to be the old triad power. We used to talk about it all the way till late 80s. Japan is a late entrant after World War II, United States, North America, and Europe is not full Europe, but only 12 common market countries. 45% of the world trade was only among these countries. They traded with each other. 70% of the world GDP was concentrated among these. The rest of the world traded their commodities, like in the colonial days, giving out raw materials for value-add work in their factories. Very different architecture. And if you look at the common denomination, as we said earlier, all of them are aging and surprisingly politically becoming unstable. That was unthinkable that these countries will have political instability. Think about America, which otherwise such a stable nation politically, but we had the Bush administration come 8 years ago, 10 years ago, totally changed the policy of the nation. Now we have the Obama administration rechanging the policy of the nation, and in 2012, whoever gets elected, if it is not Obama, you will see another change in the policy. You cannot make a long-term investment in a nation, especially in manufacturing, because your returns are going to be over 15, 20 years, and if the policy of the government changes every year or every 2 or 3 years by and large. So they're all desperately looking for employment and looking for political stability. This is the new triad power that's emerging in the process. And this is the next book I'm writing about, the new triad power, which is now US remains still a dominant power, at least economically, militarily, if not politically. But the two other anchors are now China and India. The US-China relationship is at best question mark. Some people will even put it as a negative one. US-India relationship out of nowhere has become very positive, although the two never liked each other, never agreed upon fundamental views about the world, because India, along with Nasser in Egypt and Tito in Yugoslavia, started this non-aligned movement as opposed to align with the Western world in many ways. And then you see the word Chindia there, so this is very fascinating. The interplay of these three nations will make all the difference. So Jairam Ramesh, myself, and one of our colleagues, we have an institute. Originally and very rightfully, it should be called Chindia, China, India, America Institute. We all got excited. We tried to put a logo, but it sounds like CIA Institute. which is what we didn't want to do it. Okay, I did not want America in the front, so by default, it became India, China, America Institute. By the way, Singapore becomes the most strategic city in the world out of nowhere in this trilateral play. Just like Vienna became very strategic city when the Soviet bloc was created to deal with Western Europe and with America, and Vienna became the meeting place to negotiate things, to sort out differences, to resolve conflicts. I see now Singapore becoming a very strategic city because all these three nations seem to understand Singapore, and Singapore seems to understand them by and large. So in our neighborhood around here, you will see a lot more activities among these three nations. In fact, the ICA Institute now will have a major presence in Singapore in the process pretty much, which is very interesting. So this is the ICA Institute. I have a very strong worry, by the way, that usually unless you create growth in these three markets, including America, the world economic growth will not happen. And therefore, we have to figure out what generates growth, economic growth, which I'll talk about. But the other main worry we all have as thought leaders and policymakers is that economic growth usually slows down if there is any kind of a conflict, especially military conflict or ideological conflict. I don't see another major war like World War I or II in Europe anymore. Europe is pacified. In fact, Churchill, after World War II, made the comment that if we can have a United States of Europe, just like what America did after its Civil War, we will never go to war with each other because you hurt each other. Your own assets are tied up. If the French want to be aggressors against the, let's say reverse, if the Germans want to be aggressors against the French, the Germans get more hurt, interestingly. So they can't go to war with each other because assets are tied up, people mobility is tied up, currency is the same. I don't see any major conflict in Latin America. Middle East has a couple of sparks, but it can be contained within the Middle East. If there is any major war, it is likely to be in Asia, and there are at least 3 to 4 very hot spots, and these hot spots can be ignited very quickly, just like the California dry land, and therefore it can create fire, a forest fire, which once it starts, it's out of control. If that happens, then economic growth of Asia begins to slow down. So the notion of the institute as a policy institute is to discourage from conflict and encourage economic cooperation by doing more trade, more investment, more mobility of resources among these nations, and to the extent it's possible, it'll be great, would be the idea. In fact, our Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, last week when she was in Chennai, actually referred to this openly. She believes that this India, China, America interplay will be so strategic for the next 15, 20 years that we need to understand how to enhance cooperation among these nations. And my view is that governments won't do it. It is the role of the business leaders to take charge and shape the government thinking, slow them down, because ultimately, if there are conflicts, it's the industry, the business that gets hurt, no matter where you are. We have a historical evidence for the whole thing. So what's the mission of this institute? It is to foster economic growth. And there are 5 platforms that creates additional growth. The first one is innovation. Think about Apple and its value creation. It just crossed, I think, $400 billion in market cap, which is 1/3 the GDP of India. Think about that. And it is bigger market capitalization than General Electric. Latest data just showed that. And this all within the last 10 years. If you take this decade of this century, it has more technological innovation just in the technology area called ICT. There was no Google, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no iPhone, there was no iPad. They're all very recent devices and networks, and they all have done extremely well. So I think we need to understand that innovation can really add enormous amount of growth, expands the pie of economic activity. The second one is entrepreneurship, which I will pick up later on a little more. In fact, this is where all the millionaires have come. In India, there is still the caste system, but today some of the best corporate leaders are coming from the lowest caste system, and some of the millionaires are now coming from the lowest caste system, which was unthinkable only 10 years ago that that could happen in a country. Just like in Mexico or in Latin America, you can never think that the Native Americans would ever become industrialists or thought leaders. They are basically very traditional societies where the emphasis is on the agricultural society as opposed to a modern industrial commercial society. But it's already changing enormously. The third platform is called inclusive development, which I'll pick up again a little more, which means that the bottom of the pyramid, or I like to call base of the pyramid, people who are below the official poverty level can be ignited both as consumers as well as breadwinners, as merchant kind of a stuff, and there's a whole process there in case. Bilateral trade, and of course the investment, direct foreign investment into each other country are very important among these three nations, and everybody else has to participate in these three economies in the process. So the impact of this one, if I go back to the chart, one before this one, is that this will have an impact on three areas. World's resources will be under a lot of pressure, and whoever has the resources will win the game. We thought at one time that the more we do the value add, more we do the branding, more we do the finished products, higher the valuation of the company. Today it's just the opposite. Best value is at the raw material level, agricultural raw materials, industrial raw materials, just the opposite of what I used to teach myself, and I'm changing my views now pretty much. And similarly, there will be a fight for markets, and of course there will be a fight for political power by and large. So those are the three areas I will take a couple of minutes and then move into Malaysia. The first major outcome of this race is going to be there will be a huge resource-driven global expansion. Corporations for their own future would like to secure their resources. So out of nowhere, the single largest IT company in India will be a non-Indian company called IBM. IBM will have more employees in India than any other IT services company like Wipro that I sit on the board, or even TCS, which is very large, or Infosys, or HCL, or Cognizant. Those are the five big players. IBM will surpass all of them. Not only for the domestic market, but to assure global supply. And similarly, if you are into consumer packaged goods, you want to make sure that you have access to agricultural commodities. So China has already gone, as has Middle East, to buy out a large tract of land in Sudan, which will be the farming they will do. Nothing new. America did the same thing in Latin America, where American corporations like Chiquita Banana, for example, or Del Monte had their own plantations, either pineapple plantations or apple plantations, or paper mills for that matter, the whole forestry. Doesn't make any difference. So there will be a resource-driven global expansion. And therefore, companies will come to places where there are natural resources, whether those are human capital resources, industrial resources, or agricultural resources. And this you see as a race happening, especially for oil and energy. I was in Ghana 2 weeks ago, and Ghana now has found a very large oil, and the whole world is coming to Ghana. Like Nigeria already has the oil, but Ghana is the new discoverer of oil in their backyard, essentially. That's very interesting. We will also have resource-driven global mergers and acquisitions. In other words, there will be more mergers, acquisitions in the sort of the backward raw material integration level, like mining, for example. And you have seen the fight for mining, or potash, which is a very key ingredient to make anything for pharmaceutical or anything that comes about in terms of specialty chemicals by and large. So mining and minerals is where you will see a lot more mergers, acquisitions. Some of the nations are blessed into mining are countries like Peru in Latin America. become very strategic nations out of nowhere. Countries like Ecuador, Uruguay, Paraguay is absolutely incredible. They were sort of irrelevant at one time. Now they become very strategic for the global consumption in the marketplace. Third one is emergence of strange bedfellows. So now we see enormous influence of China in Africa. You know, Europeans have been in Africa for more than 200 years, nothing happened. In less than 30 years, Chinese are exciting Africans. They are putting massive investment in infrastructure, both railroads and ICT network, the wireless telephone networks, for example. And in Africa, I saw a huge excitement, so I have preponed my forecast. I was forecasting that the rise of Africa will happen 2035 onwards. Now I'm convinced it will happen 2025. And interestingly, again, wireless technology seems to be creating more change, going from agriculture to an industrial society than the railroads probably ever did it, or the ports ever did it. In the Serengeti National Park, which is a wildlife sanctuary, I had my Airtel working at a 3G capacity. Think about that. Vodafone and Airtel are two dominant players, along with a local player called MTN, which will be also acquired by somebody else, which is absolutely incredible to think about. It is not possible even in large metro areas in most of the countries. That's the key one. By the way, India's soft power in Africa is enormous also, historically, because of the British Commonwealth architecture, not limited to South Africa. So India is using its soft power. China is using its military to some extent, but definitely its economic power. Interesting to watch the race between these two nations about trying to go after Africa, because Africa has more resources than any other continent in the world ever, in fact. Rise of scarcity-driven profits. We see more profits at the commodity level than at the finished product level. The biggest area of innovation will be shortage-driven innovation. The world demand will be so high that the traditional way of creating raw materials will just not be sufficient. In some cases, we can do a human intervention and increase the capacity. In agriculture, I can easily increase the capacity in 2 to 3 years and make it a surplus, whether it's a sugar cane, for example, or soybeans, or wheat. It's very possible. However, in many other cases, we'll have to learn cloning. Cloning, we know quite a lot. I can clone chicken. I can clone fish or shrimp. I can clone sheep if I wanted to. So I can expand the capacity by cloning. So suddenly the science shifts from mechanics and chemistry, which was the last industrial revolution, last century, now begins to go more and more to our biological sciences. So the hottest science is biological sciences, and if you wanted to put the nation for its future positioning, one needs to go into biological sciences, and nanotechnologies are the two key platforms which are radically very different. And if you can have somehow access to talent in those areas, a nation comes out very fast in the process, interestingly. And we will make sure that the resources that we use, we are much more careful in the way we use it, so the life expectancy of those resources, we will conserve more, or what is called the